Hello, everyone. Welcome back to SFC's Food for Thought series. For those of you who are just seeing SFC for the first time, we are an advocacy group made for students and young professionals, for students and young professionals who believe that Canada can have a strong future in resources, the economy, and the environment. Please connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Students for Canada if you want to learn more about what we do. Before I introduce our special guest, I will first introduce myself. So my name is Lily Peterson. I'm the Indigenous advocate for Students for Canada. And so I went to school at SAIT. I took the journalism program, and I've been with SFC for about 4 months now. Lyndon, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, Milton. I'm Lyndon. I'm a recent graduate at the University of Lethbridge here in Alberta. And I've been with SFC for over 2 years now. And really excited to have you come and speak with us today.
Hi, Milton. I'm Justice. I am a graduate from the University of Alberta. I took business. I graduated with a Bachelor of Commerce in 2020, and I majored in finance. And I've been working with SFC for about 1 year and 6 months now. So it's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm super excited to hear what you have to say today. So,
Okay, so today we are welcoming Milton Tootoosis. Milton was raised on the Poundmaker Indian Reserve west of Battleford and is ancestral territory of the sipi iyiniwak, the river people, in what is now part of Treaty 6 territory in the provinces of Saskatchewan since 1905. Tootoosis joined the Saskatoon Regional Economic Development Authority, SREDA, team in the fall of 2021 to help develop and advance strategies in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report and the call to action number 92. Milton has built his 40-year career as a sports director, HRM practitioner, a community economic developer, including serving as a trustee for his nation and an elected headman from 2016 to 2021. He is a graduate of the First Nations University of Canada, an ongoing student of the nêhiyaw worldview, nation building research, and he is a certified professional Aboriginal economic developer by the Council of the Advancement of Native Development Officers, CANDO. He is also a facilitator for the Indigenous Leadership Development Institute, Inc., ILDII. He serves as a co-founder and chair of the Saskatchewan Indigenous Economic Development Network, SIEDN, and is a director for the Indigenous Leadership Development Institute, Inc., LIDIN. Founders of the World Indigenous Business Forum. He is a connector and the founder of several initiatives. He sits on several boards and is the owner of MGT Consulting. Before I hand over the floor to Milton, please know that attendees are encouraged to ask questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box below, which we will address at the end of the session. I will share the spotlight now with our guest. So welcome, Milton, and we're really glad to have you.
Well, tawao, first of all, in my native language, the Cree, Plains Cree language, tawao means hello or welcome to my humble abode or my teepee or my dwelling, nikik, my home, or the space in this situation. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm prepared to share my knowledge and experience to date. I'm still learning. I'm not an expert on everything or anything. I am a generalist, but I will say this: when we talk about agriculture and food sovereignty, that my ancestors, I'm very proud to say, were part of the second generation of First Nations farmers on the Indian Reserve, which I come from. My grandfather, the late Adam Tootoosis, was a very successful and I guess prosperous farmer by Indian Reserve standards, but unfortunately because of policies put and enforced upon him and his generation of First Nations people, he wasn't able to expand his operation and to indeed make it more profitable. So he ended up being a subsistence farmer. So as a kid growing up on the res in the 60s, this is what I saw growing up: is grandpa, my grandma, and my other grandfathers communally working every day the farm and their own market gardens, their own little personal gardens. And so that's what I grew up seeing. And I thought everybody did that, and that everybody was taking care of themselves, feeding themselves, addressing their own food security issues and so on. So little did I know much later, because none of this was in our high school curriculum, as it's probably still the same today, that the policies enforced upon my ancestors was very detrimental to their ability to grow and prosper, as did their neighboring farmers, their settler farmer friends, just off the reserve. And so I did not know that, and I often wondered what happened and why is there still a lot of poverty in our community compared to the prosperity I was seeing as a kid when I ventured off the reserve. So maybe I'll start there and stop there and see where we go from here. And how much time do we have, by the way, Lily? And did you have questions, or did you want me to speak to something specific? Because I can talk. I love sharing, but I don't want to go off onto a subject
No,
that's irrelevant.
That's totally great. So we have about 40 minutes,
Hmm.
roughly 40 minutes. Yeah, if you, whatever you'd like to talk about, if you want to talk about truth and reconciliation, if you want to talk about industry's place in part of that, whatever you feel like you want to tell us,
Hmm.
we would be
Well,
happy to listen.
Well, I'll more or less share a story then. And I am a storyteller, and that's how we like to weave in concepts and issues and also challenges and opportunities. So where I left off was my what I'm saying is my ancestors, and I'm sure this is a common story on First Nations reserves across Canada, is that they really tried. My grandparents really tried. They were living under the premise that the treaty commissioners back in 1870s were promising my ancestors agricultural implements, a plow, a horse, all kinds of tools they needed to adapt from hunters and gatherers to become good farmers. And so they really believed that the all these tools and implements, the seeds, the twine, the carpentry tools, all those as promised under Treaty Number 6 in this instance in my region, were actually going to be delivered. The reality is they never did. And it appears that and there's archival and historical information that validates what I'm going to say. It appears that the Indian agents play a lot of politics with the tools and implements, etc., that they were supposed to transfer over to the First Nations farmers on the reserves. And so they pick and chose their favorite Indians, as we like to say. So they had their favorites, their pets, their if you were a good cooperative Indian and you were submissive and passive, and you on top of it allowed yourself to become Christianized and enroll and become an active member of, say, in my community, maybe the Catholic Church, then you were a good Indian. You were a cooperative Indian. You're in fact following the plan, and that plan is to assimilate my people so that they would no longer become any Indians, that they would essentially become brown white people running around the country and adapting and becoming capitalists and agriculturalists. And therefore, at the end of the day, because the government of the day, I almost said George Washington, but John A. Macdonald's administration, their thinking was, we have to do something with this so-called Indian problem. If I can back up a little bit, First Nations were in pretty rough shape even at the turn of the century, because even already by the 1850s and 1860s, the bison herds were dwindling rapidly. And that is a plan, a game plan by Ottawa, and they use various tactics to ensure the bison herds were decimated, because they knew that was the livelihood, that was the main source of trade and livelihood for First Nations on the prairies. So the plan they had was literally to starve out the First Nations people and starve them into submission. And we now know that the plan was starve them into submission, so they're on their hands and knees, so that they will sign this document called a treaty number 6, the so-called friendship treaty and peace treaty. And so yeah, that's the sad reality, which they don't share too much or talk about. I think Canada is a little embarrassed to actually admit and say that, but we now know that there's a lot of evidence to support that fact that I just shared. So this is what my ancestors, my grandpa, walked into. They didn't know. All they knew was, oh, we got to be farmers, I guess. Let's farm. That they didn't know that it was intentionally done that way. And so yeah, so historically it hasn't been fair, it hasn't been pretty, and it wasn't nice. And top it off, when Indian agents started playing politics with the provisions that they were supposed to transfer to the First Nations farmers on reserves, that further decimated the communities, and all of a sudden you had to divide and conquer within the communities. My little small community of back then would have been just a couple hundred First Nations band members, a Poundmaker's band. All of a sudden you had to pick and choose. Am I going to go to church? Am I going to be cooperative and be almost submissive to the Indian agent, and so I can get my goodies, so I can get moving? It's almost like I have to behave a certain way in order to receive the stimulus package, right? So if you're a have-not province, you're always on your hands and knees begging for stimulus handouts from Ottawa, right, to perk up your economy. Well, same thing was happening at a micro level in the First Nations community. So what I'm saying is our grandparents went through a lot. I'm not even going to talk about the Indian residential school experience, because that's another catastrophic event that took place that really decimated our people psychologically because of the damage that was done to their psyche because of all the mental, physical, and sexual abuse. But again, economically, if you want to control a people, you control the purse strings. If you want to control a nation, a community, whether it's small or large community, if you control their economy, you've got them. You can make them do what the heck you want them to do, just like what we're doing I hope the world is doing to Putin in Russia, in that unfortunate conflict in the Ukraine. So getting back to the latter part of the 19th century, this is where this came from. But what we're seeing now is because of this incredible experience we've just gone through, First Nations are starting to wake up. And it all started around 1969 when there was a paper proposed by the Trudeau government, not Justin Trudeau, but his daddy, his papa, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was prime minister, introduced a paper called the White Paper, the 69 White Paper. And it was ultimately a proposal to solve the Indian problem and to make some changes to wipe out the Indian Act, to do away with the reserve system, and to basically assimilate the Indians into the general population. The chiefs said, no, we're not going to have that. They revolted, and they responded with their own paper called the Red Paper, and basically rejected the 69 White Paper. And we've been, our chiefs across Canada basically were awakened by this very rude, abrupt, and invasive policy called the 69 White Paper. And at the end of the day, the Indian rights movement kind of took off then, because you have to realize, even prior to 69, even by the 50s, First Nations people weren't even allowed to hire lawyers, legal counsel to represent them if they had a case, like a human rights violation of some sort. They weren't even allowed to hire legal counsel. So it was the 69, 70s when things started to rock and roll. and all kinds of events were taking place, protest movements, etc. And really the awakening of the Indigenous community here in Canada. I think it's somewhat similar in the United States. And we've been making moves to our political leaders, First Nations leaders have been advancing policy, their policies, trying to indigenize policy with some resistance, obviously, in Ottawa, in Regina, for that matter. And but nonetheless, the Indigenous nations are have made tremendous moves. They've been winning court cases left, right, and center um, across the nation, and many judges who were supposedly neutral, taking the information they have access in terms of the arguments made in favor of First Nations rights, etc. It's been a positive trend, speeding it up to the present. Indigenous nations across Canada are starting to make tremendous inroads and progress in terms of saying we want a piece of the economic pie when it comes to mining, when it comes to forestry development, fisheries, when it comes to new explorations and maybe oil and gas, including agriculture. So yeah, so a lot of exciting things happening. It's nowhere near perfect. We're still at the bottom of the social and economic hierarchy of things. We've got far too much poverty and poverty-related symptoms, far too many people incarcerated, and sadly, far too many people trying to work their way through the stress that has been caused because of racism and colonization. And this is something we're trying to address, at least for this community, through my work in trying to implement the TRC Call to Action 92 for the Saskatoon region. So I think in many ways, we're just getting started. We are starting to scratch the surface, and we're by no means there yet. We're still trying to play catch up with the rest of society. And so it's an exciting place to be in right now because Indigenous affairs, Indigenous issues are front and center of the national media almost on a daily basis now. And in just 2 weeks' time, I'll be heading to Colombia, South America, to attend I believe it's the 11th annual World Indigenous Business Forum, where we spend two days listening to best practices, turnaround stories, success stories, and how it's just very, very exciting and invigorating to hear story after story of Indigenous communities around the world going through the same experience of colonization, systemic racism, genocide. I think the Pope finally admitted genocide was committed on Canada's Indigenous peoples here. And it's the same narrative no matter where you go. If you go to New Zealand, Australia, United States, Africa, it's the same experience, guaranteed. So at that conference in 2 weeks' time, we'll hear this is where we came from, but more importantly, this is where we're going. Right, and that's what gets me gets my mojo going and gives me a purpose and an identity and a real personal motivation to do a little bit every day, to educate, to inspire, to share stories, to connect champions and leaders who are really, really concerned about the social plight of Indigenous peoples, the so-called Indian problem, but want to do something about it in a good way, in a concrete way. So I think it's a good time to be an Indigenous person, and I'm seeing a trend whereby it's okay, and it's actually kind of cool to be talking about these issues and to actually not just talk about the Indian problem, but to actually do something about it. So I'm glad to be part of that movement, and I am just one human being from Poundmaker who's trying to do his best to keep the conversation going and hopefully on the right path. Because as Poundmaker said back in 1885, after the Northwest Resistance, or rebellion as early white scholars referred to it, he told his people, "I grew afraid when I see my people acting like this. I grew afraid and concerned when I see them just sitting beside the trail and doing nothing. we need to get up. We need to pick ourselves up, get off the ground, off the grass, and find our way. Because if we don't, we will lose our way forever. It's basically what he said. I would have said that in Cree, but Lily, you would have a hell of a time trying to translate that into English. So, but that was Poundmaker's advice. Very wise advice. Now, when I think of the phrases he shared and concepts and paradigms he was sharing in 1885, it's so striking and so true what he had to say to his people, my ancestors. And this is what I live by day in, day out. And yeah, so I just thought I'd share that narrative. And I think I'll stop there for now and answer any potential questions or thoughts or feedback from the audience.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for coming and sharing your experience. It was very valuable, and I feel like you do teach a lot through your stories. So you are definitely accomplishing what you would like to do.
Mhm.